Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout South Africa and their connections to land, water, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people listening today. Hello and welcome back to Intersectional Psychology, the podcast that explores psychology's role in promoting social justice. I'm your host, Aurora Brown. I'm a registered counsellor. This is a compilation of some of the highlights from Intersectional Psychology Season 3, which is about healthcare for trans and gender diverse people, as well as the challenges to their rights and freedoms, especially in Africa. I'll be back with brand new episodes in January 2026. Until then, stay safe and well. And remember, you have the right to live with your optimal mental health. Access to gender-affirming healthcare. What is the process for an adult to follow before they can begin receiving gender-affirming healthcare?
So obviously that process is going to differ depending on where you are and on where you're accessing your services. So, I speak about where you are in terms of geography and where you're accessing services in terms of public versus private, and also at which level, is it primary, is it secondary, is it tertiary, etc. Our guidelines and international guidelines are promoting the idea that gender-affirming care should be available at a primary care level, that it doesn't require necessarily specialist initiation or intervention. It isn't yet easily accessible in the public sector in South Africa at a primary care level, especially now that a lot of the NGO public sector partnership clinics that were providing the service at primary care are no longer funded. So that does become a little bit tricky. At this point, a patient would have to present to their primary care provider and request a referral to the transgender clinic, for example, at Groote. This process will look different depending on where in South Africa you are. And in some areas like Limpopo, or this might be almost impossible. So it's very, very difficult potentially. It does get a little technically easier in the private sector if you are able to see a provider who is informed and knowledgeable about the provision of gender-affirming care, or who is willing to learn and who's willing to prescribe the treatment for you. Then, you would be able to make an appointment with that person. Ideally, this is what would happen if you were seeing me. That person would probably give you the information I would give you the information ahead of time to read up a little bit about the hormones. This would be information that I have personally sourced and vetted and that I will vouch for as being accurate. There's great information on the internet and there's also not so great information on the internet. So I would give you that ahead of time. Some patients would want to do their baseline laboratory investigations ahead of time, so maybe go and do some blood tests. You would sit with me and we would go through what are your options, what does it look like, what are the pros, the cons, the risks, the benefits, the side effects, the consequences, the costs, etc. We go through all of it together. You'd have ample opportunity to ask questions. We would do a physical examination for you, and then we would collaborate in terms of the decision making on what is the route forward. Are you starting on hormone therapy? When are you starting on hormone therapy? What kind of hormone therapy are you starting on? So that's kind of what the process would look like in private, or in an ideal world, that is just what the process would look like, I think.
affirmation is the first step. So the first guideline is adopt an affirmative stance. What does this mean and why did it get first place?
So an affirmative stance means recognizing, respecting, and staying informed about sexual and gender diversity and applying that across all areas of practice, not just therapy. It's about centering dignity, autonomy, and lived experiences. So I believe this is the first stance, right? You have to adopt that affirmative stance within you. This stance helps us to undo the historical harms that psychology has inflicted on LGBTQIA plus individuals in our history. We all know about that. But it's not just about avoiding harm. It's about actively creating a safe space, actively participating, avoiding neutrality, like I said. So actively creating safe, caring, and equitable spaces. That includes how we teach, how we do research, how we write our policies, and even how we show up in the media. That's very important. And affirmative practice isn't blind validation. It includes space for self-exploration, ambiguity, and fluidity. But it starts from the position that identity is not a pathology. It's not the cause of distress. The systems around it are. So, and our work, when done affirmatively, helps reduce that harm and rather builds resilience.
Non-medical gender-affirming practices. You mentioned that there is a lot of misinformation about HIV and TGD people out there. There's also a lot of misinformation and disinformation, even in the media, about other aspects of gender-affirming healthcare, like hormone therapy and surgery. But there are actually also many non-medical gender-affirming practices that many TGD people start with before or even instead of hormonal or surgical transition. Could you tell us a bit more about these non-medical gender-affirming practices?
Yeah, I can. And I can tell you that a lot of people start with them long before medical or surgical intervention. I can tell you that some people start with them long afterwards, and some people start with them at the same time, and some people never do them. And the reason I'm saying all of this is just to reinforce and reiterate the idea that no two transitions look alike. The roadmap doesn't exist. So, I want to say it's different for everyone, but it actually just doesn't exist. And no singular transition is more or less valid than another one for what it does contain or doesn't contain or when it contains it. And it's for this reason that I refrain from using language like full transition. Even if we're talking about hormone therapy doses, we don't talk about a full dose because that implies that someone who's on a low dose or someone who's microdosing is somehow less than. So we really don't want to do that. And, it just comes to mind when we say this. But transition can be so many different things. And, we can divide it up. Certainly there are medical interventions, there are surgical interventions, but people can transition legally by updating their documents. People can transition socially by changing the way that they dress or using a different name or pronouns. People can pursue things like laser hair removal or electrolysis or voice training or bodybuilding. Each and every one of these can be gender affirming. And sometimes it is breaking the rules that are associated with gender that is actually gender affirming. So there are so many different ways that people might affirm their gender. And for some people, it might be binding, putting on a thick or elastic garment that flattens breast tissue to give the appearance of a more masculine chest. Or it might be tucking, where the external genitalia are folded up in such a way as to render them inconspicuous in even very revealing clothing or swimwear. But not everyone is going to do this. Not everyone should have to do this. There shouldn't be a responsibility on anyone to do this. But really, what I'm just trying to illustrate is that, this is a kaleidoscope. I mean, what I find gender affirming and what you find gender affirming could be very different. So we need to really take a much broader look at what gender affirmation is. Cisgender people do it too, I mean, cisgender men use testosterone, or they have treatment for alopecia, or cisgender women who have augmentation mammoplasties or face. That's all gender affirmation because we see these things through a gendered lens. So the idea that we could reduce it into these like medical minutiae when the entire concept of gender affirmation is actually rooted in social structure. And I'm not going to say gender is a social construct because things are much more nuanced than that, and please let's not go there. But to realize that like makeup, for example, is inherently not a gendered item, but we insist on seeing it in a gendered way. So recognizing that, I think the framework of what constitutes gender affirmation and what practices are gender affirming can be very, very different for everyone. And this is why reducing or minimalizing this lens that we consider care, and I'm not going to say healthcare, but I'm going to say care for trans and gender diverse people to this narrow focus of hormones and surgery, like that really isn't enough. We should welcome at the clinic, we should welcome people to use the bathroom or the restroom with which they identify, but we should also provide a neutral space for people who aren't comfortable in either of those spaces. And it doesn't mean now you have the men's room, the women's room, and the transes room that all of the transes must go to. It's not like that. But it's really about just figuring out what are the things that are acting actively to dismantle affirmation, and how do we deal with that? So, I've given you a very broad and ethereal answer to this question, but I think it almost necessitates that.
It goes all the way to the top. So the fourth guideline is recognize normative social contexts. Please tell me more about normativity.
This guideline encourages us to look deeper than surface level inclusion and critically examine how social norms shape mental health, particularly for LGBTQIA+ individuals. So often, one of the most powerful forces at play is what we call heterosis normativity. And this is the idea that being heterosexual and cisgender is the default, natural, and preferred way of being for everyone. And it combines what we call heteronormativity, which assumes that everyone is straight, and cisnormativity, which assumes that everyone identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth. So together, these norms create a system that punishes or erases those who don't conform through invisibility, invalidation, or outright discrimination. And I think even within the LGBTQIA+ communities, we see what we call homonormativity, where identities and relationships that closely mirror heterosis normative values like monogamy, gender conformity, or middle class respectability are more readily accepted. And this often marginalizes or exclude trans or non-binary, polyamorous, disabled, or working class queer people. So when we apply this guideline, we are acknowledging that normal is not neutral. It's actually political. So as psychologists, we need to actively challenge heterosis normative standards in our practice, in our language, in our forms, mostly our intake forms, in our research, and in our therapeutic context. If we don't do this, we risk replicating the systems of harm that we aim to disrupt.
Thank you, Tembi. I think you've really given us a good idea of how these systems of power, marginalization, and normativity are deeply embedded in all aspects of our society. So how do we apply this guideline in a way that supports queer people?
We need to understand that we can't, when dealing with queer individuals, we can't apply a one-size-fits-all. And we need to understand that what makes up a queer individual. We need to understand that the experiences of a gay white man who lives in the suburban area and a Black African gay man who lives in the rural area, or a trans individual who live in the township, their experiences are not will not be the same. So there's no one blanket fits all for queer individuals, and their experiences are also unique to their context as well. And so the social norms that are enforced on these individuals, we need to notice how they erase some queer identities, and we need to be mindful of that in our when dealing with sexually and gender diverse individuals.
The truth about hormone therapy. we get to one of the contentious areas of gender-affirming healthcare, hormone therapy. So to start with, what should we know about HT in general?
What you should know about hormone therapy is that all human bodies have, at a baseline, some estrogen and some testosterone in varying degrees, but these are both molecules, substances, let's stick with molecules, that are intrinsic to the human body. They're not foreign, they're not outside elements, they're not these synthetic, dangerous chemicals that people might make them out to be, and that many of the drugs that we use to treat other conditions actually are. We are tinkering with the balance between estrogen and testosterone, but we're doing so using those exact same molecules and hormones that your body already produces. And then the other thing to bear in mind is just that we are not trying to do anything that is beyond physiological limits. So, the body is capable and programmed to and is happy in certain ranges with these hormones. And this is what we're trying to do with gender-affirming hormone therapy. So if you're going on testosterone therapy, I'm not trying to give you Arnold Schwarzenegger doses of testosterone. I'm trying to give you physiological doses of testosterone.
When is hormone therapy prescribed and when isn't it?
When is hormone therapy prescribed? When someone wants hormone therapy, when they are gender incongruent, and when they are capable of giving consent. Sorry, that's only 3 things. But that is when hormone therapy is prescribed. There are very, very, very few of what we would call absolute contraindications to hormone therapy, cases where I absolutely cannot give hormone therapy. And that would be things like if someone has a cancer that is sensitive to one of the hormones, like an estrogen sensitive cancer. If estrogen is the growth factor, I'm of course not going to give that person estrogen. If it's someone who's had a venous thromboembolism or who has a familial clotting disease, then that could be an absolute contraindication. But other than that, we have relative contraindications. Areas where we have to exercise a little extra caution, not that we don't exercise the utmost of caution anyway, which we do. And then we have coexisting conditions that need to be managed alongside. So like high blood pressure. Doesn't mean you can't have hormone therapy until you get below a certain measurement, but it does mean that I'm going to manage it at the same time.
Feminizing and masculinizing hormone therapy is obviously quite different and has different effects. What should we know about feminizing hormone therapy?
Feminizing hormone therapy, the specifics can be a little bit different depending on the case, but the backbone of it is estrogen. And what we're trying to do with the administration of estrogen is to promote the development of what we would call female secondary sexual characteristics. So things like the growth of breast tissue, things like body fat distribution, things like changing the texture and oiliness of skin, things like promoting growth of scalp hair. These are the sort of things that we would expect from feminizing hormone therapy.
And how does masculinizing hormone therapy work?
Masculinizing hormone therapy, the backbone in this case would be testosterone, and we would be promoting virilization, which is the increase in muscle mass. It would make the skin oilier. We would see growth of facial hair. We would see thicker, coarser body hair. We would see probably an increase in libido. We would see an increase in sort of metabolic rate and that sort of thing. We would also see what we call bottom growth or hypertrophy of the clitoris. And in some instances, we would see the cessation, i.e. it would stop cyclical bleeding.
Now, if someone has already gone through endogenous puberty, there are some effects of that puberty that can't be reversed through hormone therapy. What are some of the impacts of puberty that hormone therapy can't change?
What's important to understand here is that hormones, sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone, have 2 kinds of effects. They have effects that are reversible and effects that are irreversible. And this is true whether we speak of exogenous hormones, that means the ones that you buy in the bottle, or endogenous hormones, that means the ones that come out of your body. All of them have both of these kinds of effects. Testosterone, for example, has a lot more irreversible effects than estrogen does. And if someone went through puberty and they were exposed to these high levels of testosterone, they would have developed some of these irreversible effects of testosterone, such as the growth of facial hair, such as the thickening of the vocal folds, which causes someone's voice to drop. Potentially, androgenic alopecia, male pattern baldness, could be irreversible if it's persisted for long enough. That's the effect of testosterone and its metabolites on the hair follicles themselves. So these are irreversible effects that we talk about, and someone who's been exposed to endogenous hormones will experience those. Then on the other hand, if we speak about estrogen, what are irreversible effects of estrogen? Well, that would be the development of breast tissues. So I'm talking here about structural breast tissue, glands and ducts. If there's fat in breast, which there is, some of that might distribute away and they might get smaller, but the growth of breast tissue. So if you've gone through a puberty and you've developed D-cup breasts, and those aren't going to go away unless something else is done. And then, of course, we just have to consider, when it comes to things like skeletal growth and dimensions, so the hormones do have an effect ultimately on how you grow and for how long you will grow and in what ways you will grow in the shape of bones and things like that, which are they're irreversible not by virtue of the hormones, but by virtue of time.
Gender-affirming surgery. And now let's talk about surgery. Before we get into specifics, what background information should we know about gender-affirming surgery?
I think what we should know is that this is often a facet of trans experience that the cisgender majority wants to focus on and zoom in on, and it attracts all kinds of just attention, and it's almost seen as this is what trans identity is about, is the sex change operation. And what I think is very important to realize is just that of trans people who want gender affirming surgery, which is not all of them and doesn't have to be all of them, and no trans person is less valid because they don't want surgery or they don't get surgery, it is a fraction of people who will actually have access to those procedures. And so much of trans lived experience is non-surgical. Not to say that surgery can't play a role in it, but just that it's non-surgical. And even to say that surgical experience doesn't occur in isolation, because there's so much that goes on around it that is non-surgical. So to get lost in that conversation is very unhelpful. If you want to understand trans people better, to have another pin on your ally flag, then don't start by reading up on surgery. It's not going to get you there. And certainly don't go around and ask your token trans friends about the surgeries that they've had or the surgeries that they've wanted. There is so much more to this. The surgeries can be very interesting, in terms of like anatomy and technique and so on, particularly if you do have an interest in things surgical. I find it very fascinating to understand what procedures are being done and how they're being done and what new techniques are being developed. But that's an interest that's born out of my sort of fascination with surgery in general, and not out of my obsession with what's inside people's pants.
Exporting Eden. God, guns, and glossy pamphlets in Africa. Now, when we use the term US Christian right groups, which organizations are we referring to?
So this term US Christian right, of course, is an American category used to describe the mostly evangelical branch of conservative politics, the Republican Party in the United States. And, I think it's important to mention that up until the early or mid 1990s, the US Christian right, unsurprisingly, they were prioritizing domestic US issues. The, pro-life movement against access to abortion, the anti-gay movement, and things of that nature, campaigns that people in the United States have been familiar with for a very long time. But then it was from the 1990s that they started to realize that they were losing ground at the United Nations and in many countries, particularly those in the global South. So it was around that time that we started to see the founding and establishment of U.S. Christian right groups that were explicitly dedicated to international advocacy. So organizations like the Center for Family and Human Rights, that's CFAM, they were established with the specific purpose of coordinating anti-gay, anti-abortion, etc. actors at the United Nations. And of course, at the United Nations, you have the member states, but then you also have several civil society organizations. And this has been a big place where queer and feminist advocacy groups have been working to advance rights, of course. So it was really at that time, mid-90s, early 2000s, we started to see the growth of these internationalized U.S. Christian right groups. So in addition to CFAM, there's organizations like Family Watch International that has been very visible in campaigning against comprehensive sexuality education in several African countries. And within those campaigns, there are very strong anti-LGBTIQ narratives and agendas. And then there's other groups like Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a conservative strategic litigation organization. They're operating all over the world. They do campaigns that many people will be familiar with, like from the United States, for example, like backing the baker who doesn't want to bake the wedding cake for the same-sex couple, right? And it's a strategic kind of litigation where then they're able to say private businesses don't have to provide services to people that they have conscientious objections to, quote unquote. And there's also groups like World Congress of Families and the International Organization for the Family, which convene international conferences where they gather several different kinds of far-right interest groups to meet, network, strategize, and they have extremely large convenings with thousands of people. So there are many different kinds of U.S. Christian right groups doing this kind of work, all working in their separate spheres, whether it's strategic litigation or having these convenings or mobilizing campaigns or operating at the level of the United Nations. But they all very much have a shared agenda, which is to take their ideology, their political and policy agendas to the world.
These groups aren't simply spreading conservative information. They are politicizing this idea of the family in order to create a sense of families, culture, and tradition being under attack. What can you tell us about the geopoliticization of family?
I think if I could say one more thing about this, it would be the fact that U.S. Christian right groups, and now they're global allies, right? Because there's allies and new far-right organizations in Europe and in several African countries, that they're connecting LGBTIQ plus rights and sexual and reproductive health rights and sexuality education to this idea of sovereignty, that countries in the global south are being infringed upon, they're being subject to cultural imperialism by Western progressives. And when we look at that connection that they are making, and then we also see the kinds of work they're doing at the United Nations to eliminate language around GAHC or CSE or SRHR, like we saw now at the Commission for the Status of Women, as the most recent example of this, we can see that they're not only concerned with promoting repressive laws at the national level. We can see that they are challenging the entire liberal international order. And we can see that most clearly in their attacks on the multilateral human rights system, which they target, but they are also co-opting. So we see them co-opting the language of human rights by, for example, saying that this idea of fetal personhood, that an unborn child has human rights that are equal to that of the parent who is carrying them. So, of course, that enables them to say that abortion should not be allowed. It should be criminalized. It shouldn't be allowed. So we can really see they're challenging the infrastructure and the liberal international order. And I don't stand here waving the flag for liberalism, saying it is the best system. It has many problems. And many of its problems are what have got us here in the first place to this kind of situation. But, I think we also need to think, what kind of future do we want to have? Do we want to have a future where we at least aspire to a world where equality is valued, where it is it's a value that we have, where we aspire for all human rights to be respected? Or do we aspire to a world where inequality is the norm, where inequality is something that is seen as good and necessary for societies, like gender inequality and inequality between heterosexuals and queer communities? And And finally, the kinds of alignments we can see that are emerging between who is voting against inclusive language around GAHC, for example, at the United Nations. We see several conservative governments voting together against that kind of inclusive language. And those alignments also really challenge the historical alignments we've had for the past 50 years between countries that want to have human rights and that have said that they value and they want to uphold human rights.
Platforms of harm, laws of hope. More and more social media platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, have abandoned their commitments to fact-checking disinformation that you mentioned on their platforms. They're also now refusing to monitor and censor hate speech and bullying online. Most of these companies are headquartered in the US, where there is very limited legal and governmental desire to protect marginalized people. But like you say, South Africa does have much stricter hate speech laws and even our constitution, specifically bans discrimination against anyone. So I know you're not a legal scholar, but do users of these platforms here in South Africa have more legal protection than American users? Are these companies supposed to change their policies for people around the world to adhere to our laws?
Yeah. The thing is, the challenge, and I think you've articulated it really clearly, is that these large organizations, there's really very little ethical oversight, and they are pretty much able to do what they wish. And I think the rise of Trump and Trumpism is a feature we cannot ignore here, that there's a kind of fetishization of free speech that is happening in the United States. And that these kind of guardrails that were tentatively there in these big platforms are being eroded in the interest, I think, of a kind of anti-woke drive that is being pushed by the Trump government. That any attempt to restrict what people can say, what kind of language they can use, or attempts to make the world and language and policies and spaces more inclusive are seen as anti-American. They're seen as anti-freedom. And I think it's definitely had a knock-on effect in terms of these big platforms where increasingly terrible things are being said. And it's very difficult. I see sometimes on TikTok how content creators get bullied and harassed and devastated by the hate that is thrown at them. But I do think in South Africa, we have laws that make it possible for people to then, even though some of those utterances are on those platforms, in terms of South African law, there are things that you can or cannot do. So, for example, I know there have been some recent high-profile cases, and some of those people are being taken to the Human Rights Commission, for example. These cases, often take their time through the processes of getting to a point of some kind of resolution. But I do think I'm quite proud of the fact that those things do exist, even though they're perhaps not as assertive or as powerful as they could be.
The Gospel According to Gaslight: How the Christian Right Twists Decolonial Rhetoric. As you've mentioned, US Christian right groups were instrumental in African legislation, like Uganda's 2009 anti-homosexuality bill, which became widely known as the Kill the Gays bill due to the extreme penalties it put forward, including life imprisonment and even the death penalty. However, these Western groups try to hide their involvement and culpability for anti-LGBTQIA+ actions in Africa because, as you said, it gives them a bad name. So how do they try to mask their agendas?
It's a really good question, how this is working. Because, if you look, for instance, on the Family Watch International website, you will see that they have a page now dedicated to their work in Uganda to try and clarify that they had no involvement in the anti-homosexuality legislation. But what is very interesting about those statements of clarification are that they admit that they say we weren't in Uganda helping to create this anti-homosexuality legislation. We were there telling people about the dangers of comprehensive sexuality education. And within these narratives against comprehensive sexuality education, which for your listeners who may not be familiar with it, it's really a rights-based approach to sexuality education that includes topics like safe sex, that includes topics like gender and sexuality diversity and family diversity and consent and bodily autonomy and things of that nature. It's the opposite of the kind of sexuality education that the Christian right organizations want, which is what they call abstinence only, which is teaching young people that they just should not have sex until they're married. And if they do that, they don't have to worry about, things like getting STIs or unplanned pregnancies. But however, as we know, this is not a reality, for young people in many parts of the world, that they can just abstain. And there's high rates of sexual violence. Of course, there's so many reasons why young people should have access to scientifically accurate sexuality education. Okay, so now that we've got that established, if you look at the kinds of narratives that organizations like Family Watch International and their local African partners like Family Policy Institute have mobilized against CSE, it's really a vehicle for anti-LGBTIQ agendas. So we can see they're saying things like, there are only two genders. Right? And no other genders. There's only male and female. It's biologically assigned at birth. It's a biological essentialist reality they're trying to construct. That, this is, of course, erasing and delegitimizing trans communities. Also, their narratives against, saying that teaching young people about gender and sexuality diversity will, quote unquote, homosexualize young people, like encourage them to become queer. So these are the kinds of narratives that they're using to create moral panic about comprehensive sexuality education. So that way, and also, of course, because CSE is school-based, it's something that is for young people, then they're able to mobilize all of this within a package of child protectionism, saying that they are trying to protect children and children are vulnerable, and that UN agencies and Western progressives are trying to sexualize African youth. But what we hear from young people in many African countries is they want access to better sexuality education and support and services. So this child protectionist weaponizing of children also sidelines the voices of actual children whose lives are impacted, and very much does this thing of speaking for them and trying to catalyze parent community groups, teacher communities, policymakers to turn against to completely change their opinions and they don't want to support comprehensive sexuality education and things like that. But of course, what that also does is it, like the example of the baker, I'm glad we started with that, the cake baker. I mean, once they get that precedent, that LGBTIQ awareness of gender and sexuality diversity is dangerous for children, they can snowball that into it's dangerous for society, it's dangerous for economies, it's dangerous for the nation, it's dangerous for civilization, is something we will frequently hear them say. So that's really one of the key ways in which they've repackaged and tried to make their agendas appear as though they are not hate-driven, hate-motivated, religiously motivated agendas that are just about discriminating. That they're trying to present it as though it's about protecting children, nations, economies, and so forth, so on and so forth.
How can we counter these conservative movements to improve LGBTQIA+ and sexual and reproductive health and rights in Africa?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned previously, educating ourselves about them. And sometimes, if it's too triggering, to do that at a distance, like listening to the podcasts or reading the work of people who have done the research and can kind of present it in a way where it's, you can learn from it without being brought back into a space of trauma yourself. And I think trying to educate ourselves as much as we can is really important. Also, is a very, maybe it seems like an easy assignment, but maybe it's a increasingly challenging in the world. Remaining joyful and not allowing these kinds of actors and these narratives to steal our joy, because they fear our anger, but they fear our joy even more, and it's something they will never have. I've been at their conferences. They don't know what joy is. They think it's standing on a stage and singing a song or something like that, but they have no clue of what they're missing out on and what it is they're trying to shut down. And it's the joy that keeps us going and keeps us alive, and the joy of being together in communities and meeting each other and connecting, that I think is our biggest hope. And as much as they try and censor or criminalize queer communities and gender diverse trans communities, will always be there. And that is the reality. So I think we need to always be reminding ourselves of this, and doing self-care in community to remind ourselves that, of our collective power and our collective capacities. It's just incredible what we are capable of achieving. So we have to remember that.
Receipts, resistance, and raising hell. Earlier this year, PATHSA released a brief guide to dealing with anti-trans disinformation and intimidation specifically. I'm going to include a link to the guide in the show notes for this episode. Can you tell us a bit about what you were seeing that led you to create this document?
So I think that particularly the space around trans and gender diverse people in South Africa has become more fraught in the last few years. And I would say what we're seeing is the impact of the global anti-gender movement, and particularly in its American form. I'm sure your viewers/listeners are familiar with the anti-gender movement, but in brief, it's a belief, a pushback, I suppose, against what is called gender ideology, a term that was coined, I believe, by the Catholic Church some years ago. And this alleged gender ideology was putting forward ideas about women's equality, about women's rights to contraception and abortion, and also queer rights to gender self-expression and gender self-identity, and also even pushing back against things like comprehensive sexualities education in schools. So anything that was a kind of a progressive idea around shifting notions of who's in and who's out, going back to our previous conversation, and whose rights matter. Anything that was seen as opposition to that was framed as gender ideology. And the anti-gender movement is trying to reinstate more traditional ideas about women and men and the place of LGBTQIA plus people in society. And in a way, it's really about reinforcing patriarchal interests and a particular idea of the family. And so we've seen those influences of those kinds of movements in South Africa, with small organizations starting up. People like Ingrid Lynch and others have done really good work in looking at the history of some of this work, including also Marion Stevens have started to sort of document the different groupings in South Africa. Some of them predate the anti-gender movement, but they've in a sense seen this as an opportunity to be revived in their work and reinvigorated to put forward conservative ideas about family and women and queer people and young people. I'm not going to name organizations in South Africa. There's one particular one that's proving to be, I think, interested in litigation. We may touch on that shortly. I'm not going to name them because I think partly because I don't want to give them more airtime than they deserve, but secondly, also partly to protect myself and my own interests from being litigated against. But it's a small group of people with links to an American body, and their interest is in creating, I would say, discord in the trans organized space in South Africa. And they're pushing back against gender-affirming care, particularly for young people. They're pushing back against the idea that young people could know that they're trans or gender diverse. and they're moving into the legal space to try and, I suppose, create a climate of intimidation and fear amongst practitioners who are working with gender-affirming care, particularly for young people. And they're also entering into the public opinion space by releasing commentaries in national publications or writing commentaries for journal articles or for journals. And so what we're seeing, I would say, is a kind of attempt to disrupt and to create fear and anxiety and to create consternation and dismay and disarray in the trans space in South Africa. So that was some of the context for us, particularly in Path SA, to think about, well, what do we do? I mean, we're a small body of people. Our main focus is working with and supporting professionals working in this space. And of course, there are other role players like Gender Dynamics, for example, and others doing excellent work. But I suppose it was an attempt to say, let's punctuate this moment. Like, let's stop and say, hey, what's going on here? We're noticing something. And what are some of the things that you can do to think, to notice, and to act and to protect?
So this guide that PathSA developed contains useful information for several different audiences, including healthcare providers who are facing harassment, transgender and gender diverse people, allies, and activists who are facing transphobia and harassment, and also general online safety tips for basically anyone online. So if we start with gender-affirming healthcare providers facing harassment, could you please give us some insight into the kind of harassment and challenges that providers are facing?
I think what we're seeing, I'm not going to again name names particularly, but we're seeing that I know of at least one provider of gender-affirming care is facing legal action, essentially based on decision-making around providing gender-affirming care to young people. And we know that that is a space that's become really weaponized by the anti-trans, anti-gender movement, which is attempting to create, I would say, sufficient doubt around gender-affirming care for minors in a way that in a way makes that care lack any form of credibility. And what we're seeing a kind of weaponization of science and the scientific method, and creating, I would say, and I'm sure maybe someone like Haley might have talked about this, an idea that we need a certain gold standard of evidence before being able to offer that kind of care to young people, when that gold standard is unachievable in terms of the ethics of doing that kind of research and the complexities of doing that kind of research, and also ignoring the fact that other forms of care towards young people are based on also a similar standard of evidence that gender-affirming care has at the moment. So we're seeing what is happening is that there's a kind of pushback against providers and implying that they're acting in ways that are unethical or against the oaths that they have taken as a medical doctor. And I am aware of at least one practitioner who's been reported to the Health Professions Council of South Africa in an attempt to create a kind of silencing and chilling effect. I think that those attempts are largely going to be unsuccessful because they're more mischief-making than rooted in likelihood of succeeding. And so I'm also aware that there was an advisory released by the Health Professions Council of South Africa last year around the use of puberty pauses in young people, which is one of the treatment options around gender diverse young people. And although one is not being forced to stop use puberty pauses, what it does is starts to create sufficient doubt and sow the seeds of doubt. And so I think this is what is beginning to happen, is that practitioners are beginning to say, should I carry on working in this space, or is my work actually informed by the best science? And what if I'm being sued and I lose my right to practice as a medical practitioner? What about reputational damage? So I think we're beginning to see, although the numbers are small, we're beginning to see a sense of anxiety beginning to filter out into that space. Yeah, I think that is what we are noticing in terms of providers of gender-affirming care, is that there's this general climate of anxiety and uncertainty and fear that's beginning to be generated. So if you look at the guideline that we wrote, we're not offering specific legal advice about what one can do, but it's more about stepping back, making a reasonable assessment of the risk. And I would say that includes talking to a legal practitioner, talking to the ethics bodies that govern your practice, talking to your peers who may be doing the same kind of work, reaching out to organizations like Path SA to say, how can you assist us in thinking this through? So that's definitely one of the things that we talk about in the guideline. And then the importance of documenting everything that one does in one's work. That is, obviously standard medical practice, but in this instance, it's even more important that any decision making, for example, around gender affirming care for young people is strictly done by the book, and that it's a detailed, lengthy process and involves as much consultation as possible. In fact, that's always been the standard of care. But what I think these anti-trans forces do is they start to create doubt. And part of what we wanted to do with the guideline was to say, trust yourself, trust your instincts, trust the science, trust the knowledge, speak to the community.
And that harassment isn't just causing providers to kind of step away or pull out of providing gender-affirming healthcare. It also is prohibitive to other providers or newly trained providers stepping into the field. And like you say, I think, or what I'm extrapolating from what you're saying, is that a lot of this doubt around gender-affirming healthcare and the risks associated with it ignores the risks of not providing care at all.
I think what is disconcerting to me, and I think shows up the true intentions of a lot of these anti-gender forces and people, is that they frame themselves as being concerned about the person. But I don't see that energy translating into caring for the mental health of young people.
Exactly. And when Tembi was on, we spoke about how the counseling that they are suggesting instead of gender-affirming healthcare is more akin to a conversion practice than to actual therapy. Don't feed the trolls, but don't starve yourself either. So what should providers know about participating in online spaces?
When we wrote the guidelines, we did distinguish between providers and, in a sense, the transgender diverse person or the ally themselves. But there is obviously a strong overlap between general forms of carefulness. But certainly for professional people, one can separate out one's professional profile from maybe more personal stuff that you want to do. So that is one layer of protection, I think, that you can offer. And then there are sort of general safety mechanisms around working online, checking security settings on the platforms that you use to make them the highest possible, making sure that your passwords are safe and protected, using things like double authentication systems. You need a password and maybe a PIN code to access certain platforms or for people to get to you. Platforms like WhatsApp have options where your messages can disappear or even images can be sent for a short period of time. If you belong to groups on WhatsApp, there are moderator functions about keeping people out. I know WhatsApp also has limits on how many times you can forward something, for example. So that can stop the trolls from sending out nasty stuff to a whole swathe of people. So, and I think also choosing your battles is probably another area that's important to think about in terms of online protection broadly, because that's also partly about protecting yourself. I mean, auto-critique here is that I don't always succeed myself, is that I engage another troll on TikTok and I think afterwards, why did you do that? And sometimes it might be better to work with like-minded people, find your community, than trying to tackle on the transphobes where they just pile on and then their supporters pile on, leaving you feeling very isolated. So, and again, I think that leads me also to the kind of self-care aspect of it, to monitor yourself and your consumption of online material. Many of us can get addicted to scrolling, doom scrolling for hours, or going down rabbit holes of negativity. And honestly, my biggest advice would be just pull back from that, to have a digital detox, try and give yourself a break, do things that are not online, going out into nature and the world, seeing friends, doing stuff that is affirming, exercise, all the usual things that we know about but struggle to do sometimes.
It sometimes feels like we need to be online in order to be real in the world. And with everything happening, as activists, we also feel like we have a duty to be aware of what is going on in the world. That makes disconnecting or taking a break from the media difficult. Do you have tips that could help us disconnect?
I also recognize that we all have different needs and different ways of connecting in the world. So for some people, connecting person to person can work. Other people may not be so good in the human space, and the online world feels safer for them. So to lose that can feel quite devastating. I'm thinking about the young person you were mentioning, that if you're not online, it can feel as if you don't exist, that you've ceased to be real because you haven't got that connection or that presence. But I would say it is about looking around you and seeing who are the people that are your people, that are people that make you feel affirmed, that make you feel seen, connected, valued. And that could be your biological family, your chosen family. It could be a support group. It could be an interest group, a hobby group, walking, hiking, swimming, yoga, karate. Am I revealing myself to be middle class here? I don't know. But yeah, I mean, for me, being out walking in the world, in nature, is a no-brainer because it sort of literally earths you in a different way. So I would say finding interests that are outside of the online space would be a first prize. But I recognize that for a lot of people, that is the safest space for them. The world out there isn't always so accepting or easy to be in. That is an unfortunate reality. The old-fashioned world of books and music, for me, listening to music that is of a particular emotional tone takes me to places that are interesting and restful and soothing. There are online spaces that are trans-specific or inclusive in various ways. So it's also about looking for those online worlds that are safe, that are moderated, I would say would be important things to think about as well.
Love, families, and finding your people. LGBTQIA+ people often face specific challenges with their families of origin, and so we end up forming very close attachments to our chosen families. How can we support diverse family structures and relationships, which is the next guideline?
So just like you've said that many LGBTQI individuals are ostracized by their communities, they face rejection, shame, or even violence within their families of origin. So as a result, chosen families made up of close friends, partners, or supportive networks become essential sources of love and belonging. So supporting diverse family structures mean affirming that family is not limited to biology or heteronormative configurations. And it's important as professionals that we must create safe spaces where both families of origin and families of choice are respected. This includes navigating disclosure, supporting relational repair when possible, and validating chosen family bonds in therapy within the legal systems and within various institutions. So I think it's important that we understand the potential challenges of different relationship configurations, meaning that sexually and gender diverse individuals are often scrutinized when their relationships fall outside hetero and mononormative expectations. So polyamorous, open or asexual partnerships, for instance, can be misunderstood. They are often judged or seen as unstable. And the challenges may include stigma, the lack of legal recognition, or even difficulty accessing affirming care. So supporting individuals, LGBTQIA+ individuals, and the various family structures and relationship configuration means respecting the validity of their relationship choices, helping them set boundaries, and advocating for policies that don't pathologize non-traditional structures.
What challenges impact sexually and gender diverse parents and their children?
Sexually and gender diverse parents often face discrimination. I believe actually they face a lot of discrimination. They face discrimination in adoption, in fertility treatment, or custody processes. Their families may be seen as less than or not considered legitimate. And children of queer parents may also experience bullying or stigma at schools or various social contexts. So it's important as psychologists that we must support these families holistically and understand their context. It's important that we advocate for non-discriminatory systems which affirm diverse parenting identities in our work, and recognizing that what matters is not family structure, but relational safety, love, and support. But I must also mention that LGBTQIA+ parents and families are also resilient.
Thank you for listening to Intersectional Psychology. Please follow or subscribe to the podcast to get every episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review Intersectional Psychology in your preferred app. It really helps other people find the podcast. This episode of Intersectional Psychology was researched, written, recorded, and edited by me, Aurora Brown. For a transcript of this episode, please see the link in the show notes on your podcast app or go to intersectionalpsychology.com. You can also check the website or the show notes for a full list of references for this episode. A video of this episode with closed captions is available on youtube.com/@intersectionalpsychology. To support this podcast and get access to bonus content, including additional episodes and interviews, as well as more guided mindfulness sessions, please go to patreon.com/intersectionalpsychology. You can also chat with me on Blue Sky at intersectpsy.bsky.social and Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok at Intersectional Psychology. But mostly Blue Sky. Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology are committed to the Sight Black Women praxis. All episodes of Intersectional Psychology are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be a substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I, Aurora Brown, am not able to answer specific questions about individual situations. Always seek the advice of your health provider with any questions you may have regarding a mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard or seen on this podcast. If you think you need immediate assistance, please call your local emergency number or any mental health crisis hotline. Everyone deserves good mental health.